Okay, do you want me to start?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about what 802.11 is doing and give a short introduction to some of the processes involved in creating a standard. My name is Adrian Stevens. I'm the chair of 802.11, which is the standards committee that develops standards for so-called Wi-Fi. Slide 2. What I'm expressing here is my personal opinion. It doesn't represent that of the IEEE, neither does it represent the opinion of my employer, Intel Corporation. We're recording this because others might find the information useful, and anybody can use this recording for non-commercial purposes. So let's talk a little bit about the process. There are two types of process. There's an individual process and a corporate process. But regardless, the rules are defined to create what is an open and consensus process. In the individual process, each person attending a meeting, each individual member has one vote, and in the corporate process, or entity process, one company has a vote. The openness of the process and the fact that it follows, if you like, certain requirements of different organizations, such as ISO, the International Standards Organization, and ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, means that they are willing to adopt the standards we develop because it meets their requirements. Slide 6 shows the standards development process flow. We start with an idea, and then there is a project approval process, which in the case of the IEEE is a request to the IEEE Standards Association to start a project. And then there's a group called a working group, which is where the work is done, hence the name. And they're responsible for developing an initial draft. And to the top right, you can see that there's a process here of decision making, writing a draft, balloting a draft, which means sending it out for people to vote on and provide comments, and then resolving those comments at the end of that process. And the process is iterative, so we get comments result in changes to the draft. Those changes need to be balloted. And at the point where the draft is starting to become stable, we then go into sponsor ballot, where we do the whole thing all over again with a different group of voters. So this process involves a lot of scrutiny. For example, in .11, we typically have 300 plus voters in the working group and probably 200 plus voters in the sponsor ballot group. So a lot of people have had a look at the draft, and this takes a number of years. So on the slide it says a maximum of 4 years. In fact, that can be extended. 802.11n took, I think it was 7 years. The mesh amendment 802.11s took 9 years. But typically 4 years might be reasonable for a reasonable amount of a reasonable complexity amendment. And following a sponsor ballot, it goes through an approval process in the Standards Association, and their job is to look at the process that's been followed and determine whether they have followed the rules. And then finally, the standard is published, and after a period of time, a maximum of 10 years, the standard is revised or withdrawn. In the case of 802.11, because the project is a very active one, we revise the standard every perhaps 5 years to incorporate the new amendments. So how do standards get started? Well, they go through a process called project authorization, and there's what you'll hear, a PAR request, which is effectively the form filled in to start a project. And the project can be started by an individual or company, but must be sponsored by a group in the IEEE, and they are the official developer of the standard. The PAR is considered by a committee of the Standards Association called NESCOM, which stands for New Standards Committee, and they meet perhaps 4 times a year to consider requests. So without a PAR approval, you can't develop a standard or amendment in the IEEE. After getting the request, then you develop the standard, so it's written by a working group which consists of developers who are interested in the standard. And in the case of .11, as you'll see later when I show you the structure, the working group is actually subdivided into task groups that do the real work for particular standards. So the working group writes the standard and ballots it internally, and when the working group are happy with the standard, they pass it on to the sponsor. The process we operate under is a consensus process. So what does consensus mean? Consensus does not mean everybody has to agree, but consensus means that the majority of people agree, and there is a defined level of approval that's necessary. So in 802, that level of approval is 75%. Also, consensus is obtained by allowing interested persons or organisations to ballot on draft standards. So during the working group, anybody can join the working group by attending working group meetings. During sponsor ballot, anybody can join the ballot pool by paying a fee if they're not already a member of the IEEE Standards Association and commenting on a standard. There's also a new process called public review, where any organisation can comment on a standard that is in sponsor ballot. So the process is very open, and the goal is that anybody who has a valid interest in developing a standard can provide comments on it. I think I'll skip over slide 10, I've already said all of that. So let's look at how 802.11 maps into this standards development environment. 802.11 is a working group, and our charter is to develop wireless LAN standards. And sitting above us is a group called the sponsor. This is called the IEEE LMSC, which stands for Landman Standards Committee, which is also known as 802 for historical reasons. So all of our standards have got 802 dot something. You'll be familiar with 802.3, for example, Ethernet. 802.1 does a lot of the bridging standards. We also operate under the Computer Society, and ultimately we operate under the Standards Board. Our work in .11 is divided into various activities. So we have task groups, which is where the work is done once you've got an approved project. We also have study groups, which is where people get together to discuss creating a project and to fill in the forms. And they talk about technologies and possibilities and usage models and market requirements. And then we have a number of standing committees who are responsible for ongoing tasks such as publicity and regulatory. So what's the scope of the work we do here? We create standards for wireless local networks. Typically their range is up to 100 meters, although we have examples of more in the case of 802.11ah, which is a current standard, and less in the case of 802.11ad, which is a published standard. Generally, we use unlicensed spectrum. There's an exception in a couple of cases. 11Y was a lightly licensed band in the US, and also 82.11af is TV white space, which is regulated, and access to that spectrum is controlled via a database. But generally, I would say the success of .11 is because A, it's unlicensed spectrum, and B, it's distributed channel access. That means that everybody has got a similar chance to access the medium, and it behaves gracefully in the presence of interference and other users. There are various different kinds of deployments. So Wi-Fi provides broadband network access, public venue or hotspot access. It's being used for sensor networks, particularly in 2.4 gigahertz. Mesh networks, the One Laptop Per Child initiative, all of those devices used mesh. And it's starting to be deployed in automotive. So that's for vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle-to-infrastructure usages. And you'll find it in lots of devices, so laptops, phones, tablets, infrastructure, home appliances, toasters, fridges, consumer electronics, healthcare devices, and people are increasingly putting it in devices that you would not expect. Hence my quick reference to toasters and fridges. Actually, I don't know if you can get a Wi-Fi enabled toaster, but people have been talking about it for ages. Okay, so moving on. So this tries to encapsulate the revisions. So .11 has been around for quite a while. We're coming up to our 25th anniversary of the project, and on the left you'll see that we had a revision in 1999, or a standard in 1999, and then each of these orange boxes represents a revision where we embed the amendments up to that date. So the revision published in 2003 included D, A and B. Obviously everybody knows B, that's 11 megabits, 2.4 gigahertz. A was less successful. And then the 2007 revision included 11E, quality of service, 11H, which is dynamic frequency selection, transmit power control. 11I is security. .11J was the Japanese bands. .11G, again everybody knows that. That essentially moved the 11A technology, OFDM, into the 2.4 frequency, gigahertz frequency bands. And then in 2012, this is really a mammoth revision. We had a whole bunch of projects going in the period from 2007 to 2012. So there's 11K, which is radio resource management. There's 11U, which was interworking with external networks. There's 11Z, which is tunnel direct link setup. There's 11R, which is fast roaming. 11S, mesh. 11V, network management. 11W, management frame security. 11N is the big one here that everybody will know. That's the follow-on from 11G. High throughput of greater than 100 megabits per second. And 11P is Wave. This is the vehicular or automotive standards. So the automotive standards are built on 11P as the link layer, and then there's a whole bunch of IEEE standards built on top of that use 11P as the link layer. And then there's the 11Y contention-based protocol. So the revision published in 2012 included all of these amendments. And then we go into the green, which is the current activity. We have already embodied 11AA video transport, 11AE cost management frames, 11AF TV whitespace operation, 11AC, again this is a big one, this is the follow-on from 11N, and this is the greater than 1 gigabits at 5 gigahertz. And finally we have 11AD, which is very high throughput in 60 gigahertz. And this is what is coming. So the green shows the published amendments which are rolled into the current revision, which is currently in working group letter ballot. So that's the green box pointed to by the arrow. And then as we work from right to left, you'll see we have projects in decreasing stages of maturity. So we have 11AI and 11AH, which are in working group letter ballot. And it also, in fact, this chart is out of date because the AQ is currently in ballot as we speak and terminating in the next few days. So AI is fast link setup, AH is less than 1 gigahertz extended range and low power. And then if we go to the task groups without an approved draft, we have AK, which is general link, which is intending to bridge traffic over a .11 segment and still use all of the .1 bridging protocols. We have .11AX, which is the high efficiency wireless LAN, and AX will be the follow-on to AC and will replace 11AC eventually. And we have AJ, which is the China millimeter wave project, and their job is to use the 45 gigahertz China millimeter wave bands and to rework 802.11 AD to work in those bands. And then moving to the left, we have study groups. We have next generation positioning and next generation 60 gigahertz. And I'll go into a bit more detail on some of these on the following slides. And then on the extreme left, we have what's called the Wireless Next Generation Project, WNG. And their job is to act as an incubator. So if anybody has an idea that they wish to see develop a standard, their first job is to come to Wing and to make a presentation, and based upon the warmth of the reception they get in Wing, they may eventually look to form a study group and become an amendment. This shows a comparison of the PHY throughputs you get with 802.3 and .11, and there is roughly a 10-year separation between them. So 802.3 is talking about 100 gigabits per second and 40 gigabits per second, and 802.11 currently has 7 gigabits per second in 11 AD, and we're starting to talk about increasing that in the next generation 60 gigahertz project. You could summarize the architecture. This is gross simplification, but you could view this as a marketing slide rather than a technical slide. At the bottom we have a single MAC, that's the medium access controller, and on top of it we have multiple PHYs. So we had 11A, which was not really successful in the marketplace because really it was too early. Radios were too expensive. B was successful, G was successful, N was successful, AC is becoming successful. AD is 60 gigahertz, and here the usage models are slightly different. It's not wireless LAN at the moment. It's application-specific usage models such as docking and wireless display. And so the penetration of AD technology into the market is perhaps going to be slower as those usage models and applications develop. AF is TV white space. Again, that really hasn't taken off. It's subject to change by regulation, and I guess that is perhaps causing people to delay. It's a new band, so it's not, if you like, backwards compatible to the existing projects. So again, there'll be a gradual take-up of this technology as people understand what its competitive or what its unique selling proposition is. 11AH is still in working group ballots, so there aren't implementations of that yet, and AX is still in the technology discussion phase. In this phase, a whole bunch of companies get together, both in .11 as a public forum, and they may meet together privately and decide what are the technologies that meet the requirements in the AX project authorization request. And then if we look at the Mac projects, there's a whole bunch of them here. I'm not going to read through the list. Just to point out that some of these perhaps are less successful and some of these are more successful. So, for example, actually I'm not sure I should point out any particular victims and successes. So here you see the Mac projects. AC and AD are shown as Mac projects and Phi projects because they involve changes to both the Mac and Phi. Perhaps AD was the biggest change because to achieve a link in 60 gigahertz you need beamforming at both ends of the link. So the challenges in AD were how you do beamforming at both ends of a link. And the solutions are quite different from the distributed channel access that has been the strength so far of .11. I'll talk about some of the projects we've got going at the moment. So AH is in working group ballot and getting towards the end of that stage. So the purpose of AH, actually that this is, this is AX, not AH, so ignore that slide, that's misleading. So this is 11AX. The purpose of 11AX is to improve the performance in dense scenarios. So we have reports from really dense deployments of 11N that efficiency is quite low. So there are some studies. You can go onto our web server and find the documents and the figures. But in really dense deployments, efficiency of the Mac is about 30%. And we would typically hope for perhaps 70% Mac efficiency. So the question is, can we improve efficiency? What techniques are there to enable that? There's also a question of fairness. In a really dense deployment, you have winners and losers. Some folks get good throughput, others rather less so. Can we improve fairness? So those are the goals of the 11AX project. And then, of course, we like to create a compelling need to update to the new standard. So the thing that will grab everybody's attention is the per station improvement will increase by 4 times compared to 11AC. So we're talking about multi-gigabit throughputs. And typical usage models are stadiums, airports, and apartment blocks in Japan and Korea, where there are very dense deployments of access points and where the isolation between dwellings might be quite low. Some of the highlights, this is still a work in progress, so this is just indicative of where we're going. 802.11ac includes a technique called downlink multi-user MIMO, which allows multiple stations to receive at the same time from the AP, and 11ax will extend that to uplink multi-user MIMO, which enables multiple stations to transmit at the same time to the access point. And it will also introduce OFDMA, which is using different frequency segments of the spectrum, the single channel, so that different stations can transmit in different frequencies. So now we've got two dimensions, if you like. We've got frequency and spatial dimensions, which allow for multiplicative increases in throughput. And then there are other MAC enhancements to support these PHY techniques. So TGAI is about fast link setup. So we have the requirement here is that if you've got a lot of people streaming off a train and they want to connect to a network, download messages for them very quickly within the 10 or 20 seconds they're walking past an access point, then you need very fast link setup, and you've got a lot of people, so you want to make it efficient. So it's improving the scalability of link setup. And the project started in May 2010 and is currently towards the end of working group letter ballot. So the technology is reasonably stable. And this gives you some idea of what the project does. On the left shows a lot of messages being exchanged between different entities in the network to do a conventional setup. And on the right is a descriptive message sequence chart showing how we're reducing the number of messages exchanged. And that's good both for efficiency on the air, and it's good for delay in achieving the setup. And some of these techniques will be used. I haven't mentioned the Wi-Fi Alliance yet, and this is a talk about the IEEE 802.11. But there's a program in the Wi-Fi Alliance that will use some of these techniques. TGAK is to allow a connection across the .11 network to be bridged as a general link, so that you could carry a segment of a network across .11. Now people do this at the moment. They have perhaps a long-range .11 link, and then they distribute that at the bottom end. But to achieve that, you either need a proprietary protocol running over the air, or in fact you need a router at the bottom of that link, and distribution is done at the IP layer, not at the MAC layer. So there are various applications for this. For example, in the data center you might use wireless links from top of rack to rack, and 11AD is one of the technologies being described for that. Another is in the industrial environment, where you have .11 links to MAC bridges that connect to industrial equipment. The group started in September 2012, and they're working on preparing their initial draft. And some highlights. Actually, this is the wrong one. This is for AQ, not AK, so I'll ignore that slide. This is AQ. So 11AQ is a project that improves discovery of services in a pre-association state. So that's before you've connected to a network. How do you discover if the network is one you want to connect to? There's a kind of chicken and egg problem, and 11AQ solves that problem. And what it does is encapsulate various higher layer discovery protocols so that it can be used using management frames rather than data frames, and therefore before you've associated with the network. This task group started in November and is currently in ballot, so this slide is slightly out of date. The technical highlights: it's a container protocol that will carry higher layer service discovery protocols, so example UPnP from Microsoft and Bonjour from Apple. And I won't go into any more detail of that. TGAX, these slides are obviously, I've already spoken to TGAX. I pulled these slides together yesterday rather quickly, and obviously I didn't do a very good job of it. So this is a prettier version of what I spoke to earlier. So it's a 4 times improvement in throughput. We plan to have letter ballot in the first half of 2016. And this is a diagram to back what I was saying earlier about multi-user, MIMO, and spatial multiplexing. So in this diagram, going to the bottom left is the spatial axis, going upwards is the frequency axis, and going to the right is the time axis. And so an access point will control transmission by multiple stations along all 3 axes. And actually that's moving it closer and closer to cellular technology as the AP becomes more active in managing use of resources by multiple stations in its environment. We have 2 study groups. We have the next generation 60 GHz study group, and this is a study group that is looking to extend 11AD beyond the 7 gigabits per second or so that 11AD can achieve. The technical approach is that it's going to consider our channel bonding and MIMO. Both of these give multiplicative improvements in throughput, so it's reasonable to expect perhaps a 4 times improvement. But also for free, if you like, you get range and reliability. As soon as you do MIMO properly, then you get the benefit of an improved range or SNR using the diversity that the MIMO channel gives you. And I personally think that's going to be one of the big selling factors for the next generation 60 GHz. There's also the next generation positioning project. This is just in the early stages of the study group. 802.11 2007 includes a procedure called timing measurement. The granularity of that is really not good enough for location, but it established an exchange for measuring the time delay between a station and an access point. And the current revision project, which will be published in 2016 or 17, includes fine timing measurement. And this enables a station to determine its time of flight to adjacent APs with an accuracy of about 10 nanoseconds, and that translates to about 3 meters of accuracy. So we're expecting that products will be built using this. Again, I'm not talking, this is not a Wi-Fi Alliance talk, but the Wi-Fi Alliance do have a group called Location that is going to certify this particular feature of 802.11. And typical usage models are indoor navigation and geofencing. The next generation positioning study group will then build on the work that's currently in the current revision and it will improve accuracy, scalability. So what happens if you have 100,000 people in a stadium all trying to find their seat? And we'll consider new usages such as directionality, as pointing in the direction of the AP, and determining ranging, just distance to an individual device. We have an architecture standing committee. Their job is to understand the big picture of how .11 works and how it fits in with other standards, and to make sure the interfaces we provide meet the needs of those other standards. And architecture love to draw these diagrams showing how things fit together, and that's their job. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I've gone through this material quickly. That you may well have questions. Please don't limit your questions to the scope of this presentation. As I said, what I suggest we do is that we have questions that are general, and then I'll stop the recording, and we may have questions that are specific to your needs as a steering group. So I'm open to questions now. Shoot.
Great. Thank you very much, Adrian. I will sort of try and take questions and put them across so that we have a structured discussion. But thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
Any questions, ladies and gentlemen? I don't understand of my iPad.
You may need to repeat questions because I'm only hearing fairly at a low level what people are saying in the background.
Okay, we'll speak loudly and then repeat it quite clearly for you.
Just a question around, I think it was slide number 17, where you had, all the various, that one. And you made mention of the fact that some were more successful than others. Do you perhaps have more detail around, where all of these standards have been deployed and to what extent they are successful across various geographies?
Right, so thank you for the question. I can talk about my understanding of the reasons. My knowledge is limited about deployments, but I'll speak based on what I know. I'm willing to share my ignorance with you. So 11A was not really successful because it was a technology that was too early. So it was technically challenging to build a 5 gigahertz radio at the time that 11A came out. And also there really wasn't the demand for 54 megabits of throughput. At the time you might have had 1 or 2 megabits of internet connection. And so people didn't really see the need for 11A. About the time that G was being created, this was a number of years later, so we're probably talking 2002. 11A was 1999, so it's 3 years later. It's a generation of RF devices, and now the OFDM part of 11A, which required a lot of signal processing, could be done, but there was still no great incentive to go to 5 gigahertz because the RF part was still expensive. 11N was successful because it was still in 2.4, and it was a relatively straightforward technology to implement by the time the standard was approved. 11AC is becoming successful and is displacing 11N. AD, as I said, it's kind of application specific, and therefore you need the market's going to grow as people initially don't understand the benefits the technology can provide. and it takes a while for the applications to develop. So I think you can expect AD to be slower. AF depends upon regulation being right. Also, one of the issues with 11AF is that you have the spectrum in the places where there aren't the people. So if you look at a map of the US to see where the spectrum is available, it's available in the middle of the states where there aren't many people because there aren't many television stations using the spectrum. And in the big metropolitan areas, there are very few channels available because they're all used by television. So that's the commercial issue that 11AF have to address. 11AH, it's too early to say because the standard's not complete, and also with 11AX. So let me come back to you. Are there any specific standards you want to understand more about?
No, I think my interest was really around whether the success of some of these standards, depend largely on, the context within a particular geography. So some of the examples that you had quoted when you were going through the standards are places like, Korea, where, you have very high densities in terms of population. And I would be interested to know whether you see a difference in success in areas where there is, perhaps different factors when it comes to that geography, such as Africa, for example.
Right. So I see several factors affecting that. Firstly, there's you're probably more controlled or determined by the infrastructure than the mobile devices themselves. So if you buy a Samsung phone, and I'm not supporting any particular manufacturer, I'm using this as an example for the record, it will have 11AC in, and they don't provide different technology to different countries. They want a single phone, technically a SKU, stock keeping unit. It costs them more to provide different capabilities to different countries. So the mobile phones, the tablets, the laptops will all have the same functionality. But the question is, building out the infrastructure, how long does it take to refresh your infrastructure? What are the commercial incentives for that? In countries like Korea, they very aggressively update their infrastructure, which means the backhaul lines and the access points. The Korean government, and I'm talking about South Korea obviously, is very supportive and strongly supports this activity. They have a research group called ETRI that are very hooked into the standards development process. So they're an example of a country that takes proactive steps to make this happen. In other countries where you've got a large rural population, India is an example, updating the backhaul might be the limiting step, in which case there's no great incentive to have an access point that will do 7 gigabits if your backhaul does less than that. So the costs of deploying the technology are probably dominated by the costs of deploying the backhaul. And there are options, there are microwave links, there are new technologies that may lower the cost of the backhaul, but you've still got to provide power and provide new access points. So for instance, you might find the technology deployed in a business in a more rural country, but not more generally deployed either at home or in public places, unless there's an incentive to do so.
Thank you very much, Adrian. And again, on behalf of the group here, let me take this opportunity to thank you and your time and great presentation and great job in IEEE and all the work you guys are doing for the benefit of the whole world and the and society in general, in business and communities. And again, we'd like to thank you for your time and your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.